welcome to our show, Replicating Reality. I'm your host, Alexander Metajevic, and we have an exciting episode for you. We'll be learning about N-scale model railroading, 3D printing, and model boating. We also have a special guest, Andrew Karolis, here in the studio to show and tell us about the miniatures he built and painted. Andrew, it's great to have you on today.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Awesome. Well, I'm looking forward to hearing all about these miniatures. But for now, let's hear about how the Milwaukee N Southeastern Model Railroad Club replicates reality with their model railroad. After that, Brian Meninaw is going to tell us about his 3D printing hobby.
Model railroading is a hobby. It's been around for a lot of years. Model railroading is pretty much creating a version, your version of reality, but scaling it down to a different size.
It is taking reality and shrinking it down into something that you are creating your own miniature world. It's unique in different types of miniature modeling in that it actually moves. This is known as N-scale, and it's probably the second most popular scale in model railroading right now.
Our scenery on our layout is kind of it's a mixture. We have a couple people that are very big into scenery, and a lot of it is just plaster cloth like you would get with a cask, and you put it over styrofoam, and then you color it with a coloring, a pigment, and then you can use ground foam. Different companies sell ground foam, and you put a base color on it, and then you cover it with ground foam, whether you want fall, summer, spring. There's actually some natural weeds that can look like trees. Pre-made trees, they're a little expensive. You can also buy just the trunks and make your own trees with foliage. And this layout's kind of a mixture of all those.
There are buildings that we can make. There are companies that make kits that you can put together, just like the old model car kits. But in this case, we're actually making a structure or another type of a vehicle. We even are modeling nature. Example, trees. There are more than a half a dozen different methods of us making trees. But again, bringing reality down to 160 parts of what the reality was. How tall is a 55-foot pine tree? Well, this is 50 feet of pine, and this is a model. This is actually built by a company as a pre-made object, but we also can make them out of natural materials. Some we purchase as kits, some we purchase completely built, others we make completely from scratch. And that is where the term scratch building comes from. Water is a different thing to try to model. Obviously, we can't just pour water on there. I mean, it doesn't look, the physics of water at this scale don't flow like water would flow. You don't typically use real water. You use other things to emulate it. It can be as simple as painting lighter colors around the surface or edges of a stream and darker colors toward the middle, and then just simply coating it with a clear glue-like material just to give it a shine on the surface. It can be as simple as that. There are other aspects where you can actually put stone and twigs and leaves and chopped up small bits and pieces down and then pour a resin over the top, an actual mixture, a chemical mixture that is a plastic, and you can pour it in place, and then it will chemically harden into a shiny plastic surface.
One of the other features on our layout is a fairly large depot with columns on it like a big Union Station. It's interesting because that kit is actually an HO scale kit, so it should actually be too big for the layout, but the way our member built it and moved the back of it kind of off to the sides, and he did some painting on the doors and actually put them on upside down so that it looks like it's a smaller door for smaller N-scale figures. And he actually put an interior in it. So we have a lighted interior in our Union Station with the big columns in the front. He also put a wristwatch base in there. So we have a working clock in our N scale, which is actually HO scale, Union Station. So yeah, I really think it is the people that make the hobby, and that's one of the things about coming down here and having our own club room, is that we have a place where as members we can congregate, share ideas and talk, but it's the people that are in the hobby that really make it interesting.
In order to kind of explain 3D printing as a general overall concept, I would describe this as a process of creating essentially anything that you wanted to inside a digital environment, 3D software, 3ds Max, Blender, so many great 3D tools out there. An object, element, thing that you create in that digital space can actually be exported out to a device, a 3D printer, that will very thin layer by very thin layer build up a physical representation of that digital thing that was only inside the computer a matter of minutes or hours before that. Whether it's FDM, fused deposition modeling, which basically builds in thin extruded layers of like plastic, that it lays down really hot levels or layers of beads of plastic that stick to each other and builds up a pretty robust, solid plastic object. Usually made of a type of plastic called PLA or ABS. Both very high strength, far more so than the resin that we're using in a lot of more fine detail resin printers that use liquid UV resin that's cured using UV light. So when you're creating content, initially as you start sculpting things that you're going to end up 3D printing, there's a couple different mindsets that you would want to go through, right? Depending on what you're actually creating. An object or a character like this is very, very simple and has a lot less polystructure and detail than something like this that's incredibly detailed and has a lot of very, very fine surface structure. Those are made very, very differently. The low poly character, my Bride the Builder character that was made completely inside 3ds Max, low poly modeling, pretty straightforward. The Death Dealer character that's based on a Frank Rosetta painting, that was done in a tool called ZBrush. ZBrush is specifically designed for doing very high detail work and very high quality sculpting. So this little character, this guy was probably only a few hundred to 1,000 polygons maybe. This guy is 40 million polygons. So a huge dramatic difference in the amount of geometry used to make something like that. So the apparent physical surface detail is dramatically different when you have that much difference in the amount of polygons on an object. For me personally, I've been into 3D printing for about 3 years now. I started out with a relatively small 3D printer, actually purchased specifically to make some Warhammer add-on parts for another instructor here who I was doing a build for. And so I needed to add some extra stuff to his model. So I bought a 3D printer so I could like model and print my own add-on parts for him. Since then, I've found so many uses for 3D printing. I do actually have elements like that I do sell on my Etsy store, but I've also found all kinds of uses around my own house as something may break or I lose an element of whatever. I can very quickly go on my computer, model a replacement part and then 3D print it and have a replacement piece within a few hours sometimes. And it's really, really amazing to be able to have that as a possibility. So I don't necessarily have to worry about going on Amazon to buy this one replacement thing or have to buy that 10-pack of replacement things. Build my own. And the cost of 3D printing is coming down so much. And so, you know, between the slightly more kind of brittle resin printing and then the slightly more kind of robust FDM printing, there's so many things that you can do at home to create or like make parts that you need to replace parts around your own house. There's also people that have now basically like bought a couple like 3D printers and have their own businesses just as their own personal 3D print farms. So there are so many places that things like 3D printing can really go that it's pretty much endless. It's so open.
Well, that was really interesting. I liked hearing about all the different techniques that they used. But Andrew, these miniatures have been sitting here for way too long without me getting to know them. So just tell me about the miniatures. Like, what are they? What do they represent?
Sure. So I play a lot of war games, and one of my main ones comes from Games Workshop called Warhammer 40,000, as we just heard. There are a variety of miniatures here. They are actually from different games. So those two over there are going to be from Warhammer 40,000. This one's going to be a historical game called Bolt Action, and this one is a fantasy game called Warhammer Age of Sigmar. More interestingly, though, is they're all green, aren't they? In some capacity. I really like painting green. So it just really comes out in my miniatures a lot.
Well, I mean, I do think that the extra color helps them to pop out really well. But speaking of color, what kind of painting techniques did you use on them?
Well, different ones of all kinds. There's kind of three main ones I like to use. So layering is it's a way where you start with a base color and you work your way up from that. So you start with a darker color, usually a darker green in my case here, and you start adding lighter and lighter colors as you go, which then builds up highlights. Those highlights then draw your eye in and really make it pop. You get to see the details a lot better than if it was just a plain flat color.
I know from the very limited experience that I have with painting miniatures that shadowing or shading is very important. What do you use, or how do you make sure you get all of the right shadows and the right shading into each of the models?
Of course. So there's a variety of techniques. You can use washes, which is basically a really thin down paint, really thin down, like you're thinking like almost watery. But what it does is that runs into your recesses and it really brings out that contrast line, which again, just like highlighting, it helps kind of exaggerate the look so that you see more than you actually see.
All right, awesome. So how do you decide on the color scheme? Do you use reference material? Is there color schemes in the story of these games, or do you make them all your own different color schemes, your own original color scheme?
That really depends. So like with historicals, especially with this group here, I did a lot of research into finding out like what did the uniforms look like, what did the tanks look like, what insignia did they wear. I did try to match that as much as I possibly could because it was a break away from my normal of doing fantasy and sci-fi stuff. In those cases, you can really kind of go wild and really choose your own. There has its own lore, I guess you could say, and there are like designated colors per se, but it's your hobby. You can really do it any way you want, and it's all going to be good.
All right, awesome. So I know when it comes to like the more fantastical settings, right? Of course, there's going to be different, body shapes, different creatures that have to be represented in model form. But do you think that, say, these models themselves sort of are the perfect representation of these fictional, fantastical beings, or as close as we can get to them in reality, even though they're on the tabletop?
They are as close as we can get because as well, they're used as gaming miniatures. So you're going to see a lot of play. There's going to be a lot of touching, a lot of moving. There's only so much detail you can really put into that before it gets a little too fragile and it might break during gameplay. Now, there are some models that do push the limits. For example, this guy here, he really is, he is attached by his cape to the wing of his creature. So it's not tenuous, like it is pretty sturdy, but you look at it and you're like, whoa, should I touch that? Should I leave it alone? So,
I mean, that brings up a very interesting point. So from the limited knowledge that I know, when you do receive the boxes to sort of assemble them, they're all very raw, I would say. So they come in sort of, their assembly packages. They're not put together, so you have to assemble them yourself, right?
Yes.
What would it take for, say, a beginner that's just entering this hobby? How much skill, how much finesse, or what could they expect from trying to assemble their first model?
Well, the good news is there are a lot of models out there that they're called easy to build because they're easier to build. Something like this is going to be very complicated, but an easy to build model, it comes with a much more simplified sprue of pieces. Pieces are much more chunky, they're easier to put together, like it's just very straightforward. So you can start with that and then work your way up to more advanced skill level models. So another good way to really get into the hobby is find somebody who is into the hobby, just have them show you the ropes. Because somebody that's skilled, kind of guiding you along the way, it goes a long way.
All right, excellent. And which model of these that you brought in would you say is your favorite? And what is the story behind it as well?
Sure. I have, well, the problem is I brought in 4 favorites. So among these, though, I think I had the most fun. I can't really say. How about I point out the bits that I liked on each one that were the most fun?
Sure.
I could do that. So for the guy on the right there, or on the left, the shield on his front has this cool like lightning design on the front. That was a happy accident, actually. So that was using an airbrush. First I painted on lines of like kind of electric looking, and then I used my airbrush to kind of give it that blue look. However, I did not get the mix right, and it ended up being thicker than it should have been. So it kind of came out as this kind of spattery look that was really random. Usually not ideal as far as airbrushing goes, but in this case, I think it looks really cool as lightning. So that was really fun. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, excellent. I mean, I do think that that sort of blue adds a nice, touch of extra color to it, especially in the front there. I think it's a really cool effect as well, right? Because it looks like lightning is coming off the shield itself, right? But as much as I like the more sci-fi or science fantasy settings, I'm also very much interested in historical settings. And I know you pointed out this one in the middle here. Specifically, is that a patent tank, or what kind of tank is that, and what kind of division, I guess, is this model representing?
I wanted to make this army. That actually is a whole army in terms of the game. It's very, very small, but I wanted to make the 4th Armor Division, which, I don't know, it just is something I really liked to read into. This one in particular is actually an M18 Hellcat, which is a tank destroyer. It's kind of a speedy recon kind of tank that can also take out things much larger than itself. I combined that with a whole bunch of infantry, and I found the right decals to put on their shoulder pads or their shoulders, and they're very, very, very small. But not a problem. Easy to put together and have a lot of fun building and painting. Again, colors I really like to do.
Excellent. And just really quickly, again, which one would you say is probably your favorite here? I know you've just briefly went into it, but just which one?
I'm going to go with this guy on the right here. It's just a whole bunch of interesting colors and techniques I use to make it work.
All right, excellent. Well, I'm afraid that's all the time we have today. Thank you, Andrew, for coming on the show and showing us all of these cool miniatures.
Thanks for having me.
All right, now it's time to switch gears and hear about how the Wisconsin Scale Boating Association builds and sails their model boats.
I got into this hobby probably in the 1990s, as I've always been interested in boats. I've been sailing with my parents on a sailboat in Lake Michigan, so my first radio-controlled boats were sailboats. From there, well, if you have a sailboat, you might need a boat to go rescue the sailboat if the wind dies, so you get your first power boat. Then you find somebody else that has another boat like yours, and pretty soon you're showing up at the pond at the same time as your brand new buddy, and before you know it, there's 50 guys in the club, and you've been doing this for the better part of 40 years. My path here really came from sailing. I love sailing. I teach sailing to juniors. I've got probably 15 sailboats, a handful of power boats as well. So it's just the thought of being able to build and operate something that's a miniature, but it still functions like a real boat. You know, there's the added skill level where you're not on it to see where it's going. You have to do all that from shore. If your goal is to build a scale model of an actual ship, the first two things you absolutely have to have, you have to have plans and you have to have photographs. Plans can be obtained from a number of sources. There are model plans and there are real ship plans. If you're able to get the plans from an actual ship through museums or the original manufacturer, you just have to remember that there are certain things you'll have to convert into model making dimensions. But in reality, everything is scaled down. You pick your scale and you start doing some math. If the real ship is 100 feet long and you're building to a scale, you divide 100 feet into so many inches and you build everything to scale. Knowing what things are and what they do on a real boat helps you build the model, because then you'll know what to paint it, how to weather it, make it look like a real boat that's been sitting outside doing work for a number of years. It really becomes obvious when you don't know those things, because they look more toy-like if you don't have that, if you don't have that down. Being that we attend this show every year, I try to bring different boats every time. As I said, I've got a number of boats. So right now, at the end of the table, I've got 4 sailboats on display. They are typically built in the traditional way for sailboats. 2 of them are fiberglass hull. One of them is a plastic racing boat, and one of them is a fiberglass racing boat. Radio control sailboats are powered by the wind. They sail just like real sailboats do. So there are no propellers. You can adjust the sails and steer. So they have all the same settings that a real sailboat has. I also have a tugboat that's under construction right now that I got from a friend in the club. And he's an older gentleman who's got a lot of health problems, so it's going to get renamed in his honor, so that something that he started probably 4 decades ago can continue on. And again, you bring something different wherever you happen to go for whatever show you're doing. In this case, so we get a lot of families that come through here, so it's nice to kind of spread out a little bit and have a little bit of everything on display. This club has been in existence since the 1980s. Some guys like the camaraderie and the operation, so they're completely okay with buying a ready-to-run boat, charge up the batteries, throw it in the water, have fun on a weekend. Other guys have spent 10 years working on something that's still not done yet, because that's what you do. Very much like model railroading. You build a miniature world in your basement. It's never really done because you're always changing things. The room that we're currently meeting in, we meet in the evenings. We have an unlimited time there, so we can have a 1-hour presentation on airbrushing a model, on how you can make weathering effects, how you can do this and that. So keeping the skill of craftsmen alive is part of what we do, and we love to show it off. If you're interested in model boats but don't know where to start, the best thing to do is join a club. Find a club, find an organization, find somebody in your area that you can lean on for a lot of things. We can throw a shout out to the membership of this club. In today's day and age, with a lot of activities that are possible, this is still a very hands-on, crafty kind of thing.
Well, that makes me want to go boating, but I don't think I would fit on any of those. I would need one that's actual size. Before we go, Andrew, I have to ask, what models are you working on right now, and what do you plan on working on in the future?
Well, I have actually some ship models in my future. They're very, very small, miniature size, even smaller than those. So that's one thing on my desk. I also have some more Warhammer 40,000 armies on my desk. There's always more of those that forever going to be interested in. And yeah, I have a lot of gaming interest and a lot of models that go right along with it.
Oh, excellent. Well, that's all the time we have for today's episode. Thank you again, Andrew, for coming on the show. It was great to have you on.
Thanks for having me.